Welcome back. One more video for you this week. This time I want to talk about the history of the kind of time period that we're going to be looking at and the kind of historical and cultural context that our poems emerge from. I think I said in another video that all the poems are going to come from the civil rights movement in America. And that's probably a time period that we have more familiarity with than, World War One and the 19 teens and stuff. So in a way, that's good that we have, probably some more background knowledge here. But I think there's also a way that a lot of the stuff that we learn, especially in high school, about the civil rights movement and this time period, can kind of be a problem for analyzing it in a more serious way. I think I'm going to end up talking about this in a few videos, but I think the kind of version of the civil rights movement that we tend to learn, what the article I gave you for homework, Christopher Metris, that author, what he calls the short civil rights movement, as this, kind of going from like 1954 to like 1968 or so. And that we kind of just look at this as this very narrow thing that lasted 10, maybe 15 years. And I think one of the problems with that, and I won't say too much because I'm going to do a whole video on that essay, but that kind of the implication there is that, well, after, 1965, 1968, after that we kind of fixed it. And I think that's what, like, looking at it in this very, small way where Martin Luther King is, like, really the only figure that we look to. People know about Malcolm X, but we try not to talk about him, right? He was a little too wacky. So I think there's a lot of problems with the like normal or general way that this gets taught. Maybe you had someone who didn't teach it this way, and that's good. But what I want to go through is first, I guess I'll go through some of the important time periods that, some of the important events that we've probably have learned about as being associated with the civil rights movement. And then I kind of want to expand the timeline and look at some of the things, before the 1950s and some of the things after the 1960s that a lot of historians like Christopher Metris would argue should be included in the civil rights movement. And I, tend to agree with that. So, first of all, just with looking at the, more standard ones that get taught, we have things like Brown versus the Board of Ed, which Supreme Court decision in 1954 that had to do with desegregating schools and integrating schools. In 1955, we have the bus boycotts in Montgomery, Freedom Riders, Rosa Parks, this type of stuff. I think we've learned about that. And then we get the Civil Rights Act in 1964. So in between there's obviously a lot of protesting and sit-ins and other boycotts and strikes and things like that. We get the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which made it illegal to have the kind of segregation that was existed in the South before that. And then we also get the Voting Rights Act is 1965, which made a lot of the things like these, like they used to do like literacy tests for voting where they would make people prove they could read to let them vote, or like a poll tax where they would try to charge you money to vote, or just not having polling stations in black neighborhoods and stuff like that. So that law was supposed to make all of that stuff illegal. Those are really the two kind of, I guess, biggest achievements of this kind of narrow civil rights movement, are the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act. And then you have things like the Memphis sanitation strike that Martin Luther King was heavily involved in 1968. And I wanted to mention this one because I think, like, even I think even the way we learn about Martin Luther King has kind of been sanitized, where we make him seem like all he ever talked about was getting along and peace and coming together and stuff. And like obviously he was committed to nonviolent protesting, and his movement was very much, or at least his part of the movement was very much within like the Christian church and all that. But there was also another side to MLK's radicalism and advocacy that had a lot to do with labor, and with things like jobs and minimum wages and this sort of stuff. So the fact that he was involved with something like a strike of sanitation workers, just shows, you know, how much bigger that was than people like to make it seem. You know, like when we talk about Martin Luther King, does, you know, like the striking come to mind? Does labor rights come to mind? And I think MLK knew, and you know, which should seem obvious, that if you're trying to improve the life for Black people, you're also trying to improve the lives of poor people, right? Because just disproportionately, there were more Black people who were poor, you know. Um, so yeah, he was a part of strike. He identified as a democratic socialist. He spoke out against capitalism. And then we have maybe a related thing that in 1968, Martin Luther King gets assassinated. Oh, one other one I wanted to mention: 1963 is the March on Washington when he gives the "I Have a Dream" speech, and then just 5 years later, he ends up being assassinated. So that's kind of, I think, the short civil rights movement, how it's thought of, is going from something like 1954 to 1968, with the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act being the main achievements, and with Martin Luther King being the main figure. Yeah, this is just a very reductive way of looking at this, right? And I think that it's kind of for a reason, because again, this is a way of learning about the civil rights movement that makes it seem like, you know, like America learned that it was wrong, you know, like, oh well, Martin Luther King showed everyone that this stuff was bad, and then we said, oh, okay, I guess that's true, and then we fixed it. And that's just not the case, as we all know, right? That's just not the case. And it's also very weird to me to put this artificial starting point on it. Like, why do we look at Brown versus Board of Ed as the start of the civil rights movement? It's like literally since Black people were brought to America as slaves, there was always a movement against the oppression of Black people and the enslavement of Black people. So I really have to question this idea of, oh, it's from 1954 to 1968. And I know that's a convenient way to talk about this stuff if we make it a smaller time period that makes it easier to deal with. But I just think there's a lot of problems with that, and we miss a lot of stuff. So I just wanted to add, um, like, some of the things that happened before the 50s that I think we need to think about, and that should be seen as also part of the civil rights movement. So, you know, for instance, I think we need to go back to 1619 when the first slaves are brought to America, right, as part of establishing Jamestown and the British colonies and all that. Um, and then something else I want to look at in this early time period. There was an event in 1676 known as Bacon's Rebellion, and this was, you know, a kind of yeah, rebellion, armed struggle against the government. And what was unique about this, I think there maybe had been like a few of these in this early time period. Like I think Jamestown, you know, gets burned down at least once during this time period. But Bacon's Rebellion specifically is of interest in terms of the civil rights movement because it was uh, like poorer white, like indentured servants and people living on like the frontier of the colony, coming together with black people who had been brought over as slaves, and they so you had basically the most oppressed white people, the most oppressed black people coming together and kind of rising up against the authority figures and the rich people. And this was horrifying to the people in charge. This was something that they could not have because if you combine the white indentured servants and the black enslaved people, you had like a critical mass that could really overturn the situation there, overturn who's on top and who's being oppressed. So this is after Bacon's Rebellion is when you really see like a hard distinction between being a slave and being an indentured servant. So after this rebellion, they passed the Virginia Slave Codes in 1705, which had things in it like they made it illegal to whip a white indentured servant in public, but you could do it to a slave. And just like some other kind of minor things like this, right? And they kind of made it even more so that you had to have a contract with a white indentured servant. Indentured servants, they would basically a rich person would pay for their voyage to come over to America, and then they would have to work for them for 5 years or 10 years or whatever it was. And then they would say, oh well, you agreed to it, and there would be an end to it. So it was different from slavery like that. But basically, after Bacon's Rebellion, they really tried to put into laws a distinction between, the poorest, most oppressed white people and the poorest, most oppressed black people. So basically, they tried to make sure these two groups wouldn't get together by giving the white indentured servants like a couple of minor privileges, like I said, like not being whipped in public or something, that slaves didn't have, and they really wanted to make racism more of a thing than it even was at that time to drive a wedge between this group of the lower classes. So that was 1676 that rebellion happens. Another event, this is 1791, so we're definitely skipping ahead a little bit. And this one doesn't actually happen in America, though it's close by. 1791, you had the Haitian Revolution, which Haiti at this time was it was owned by France. It was a colony. They mostly grew sugar. It was like one of the most basically created the most wealth of anywhere in the world from sugar that was used for food and also for rum and stuff like that. It was the wealthiest colony in basically the entire world, and the conditions were just appalling. Sugar was like one of the most dangerous things to harvest. It involved like machetes and swords and stuff, and people would lose limbs all the time. And it was, yeah, just terrible stuff, right? Horrible, horrible conditions. And there were way more, I got to a point where there were far more enslaved black people than there were white, plantation owners and even like more white, like overseers and stuff. And the slaves eventually, around the time of the French Revolution is happening back in France, and the slaves in Haiti got organized. They had eventually a leader kind of emerged by the name of Toussaint Louverture, who became like their general and led the army. But basically, the slaves of Haiti led an armed rebellion against the slave owners, and then eventually against also England and Spain, who, once the slaves were having an uprising, they were kicking the French out. Other European countries and also America tried to get involved to put down this rebellion because it was bad for all the European countries. For America, none of these places wanted to see slaves rise up and take control of a country, right? That was a big problem for them. So they all tried to invade Haiti. They tried to ruin the new country that was emerging, and the new Haitians they successfully fought off everybody. They were an incredibly impressive army and very well organized. So that's 1791. You have this revolution, and I think it's important to bring up, even though we're talking about the American civil rights movement mostly, and all our poets are going to be American, to see kind of like the international character that a lot of this stuff had. Like nowadays it's so easy for us to just only think about America. We don't really think about other places, but it really was more of an international kind of movement in this way. Okay, some other historical events. Another rebellion, we have Nat Turner's rebellion was in 1803, and this was there were and this kind of stands in for I think a lot of rebellions that are like this, where it was what happened with the Haitian Revolution, but on a smaller scale, where you would have the slaves of a certain plantation, burn down the house, kill the masters, whatever. Nat Turner's was a more successful than most. It lasted longer. I think they were able to get to a few different towns and stuff and kind of take things over and eventually gets put down by the military. But this just shows like how even though this is 1803, right? This is very early that there were still like that kind of revolt. I think needs to be looked at as part of the civil rights movement because it was the way to go against slavery. I think you would have to say that Nat Turner was fighting for civil rights, right? So it just seems weird that we would disconnect something like somebody like Nat Turner from MLK and Malcolm X. Like I think they're part of the same project, right? Even though it's a long period of time later. So skipping ahead even more, 1865 we get the end of slavery, right? Even though I think the Emancipation Proclamation is like 1863, but slavery doesn't really end until the Civil War ends, and even probably a while after that before they can actually enforce the end of slavery throughout the South and everything like that. Um, and people like to say, some people like to say that the Civil War was about states' rights or something, and if you look back at the time period and if you look at people writing about it then, everyone knew it was about slavery. You know, you could say it's about states' rights, but it was about the states' rights to have slaves. You know, like that's really what it was when you look at the events that preceded it in terms of the Missouri Compromise and all these different compromises about where would there be a slave territory, where would be a free territory for like the new territories and states coming into the country. So really, the end of the Civil War is the end of slavery. So again, like how could you not view the Union and the Civil War as part of the civil rights movement? You know, like that's one of basically the main thing was about ending slavery. And preceding the Civil War, there was also a lot of abolitionists, even among white people. Um, and of course, there were people like Frederick Douglass and other former slaves who were able to gain platforms to speak about this kind of stuff. But yeah, there was a large abolitionist movement. There was certain religious sects like the Quakers and a fair amount of Christians who opposed slavery on religious grounds. So yeah, I just feel like you have to see the abolitionists, people who were creating a movement to abolish slavery. How could they not be part of the same thing that Malcolm X and Martin Luther King are doing later? Okay, so after slavery, this is when I probably have a lot to say about this. So after slavery, you get Reconstruction, right? And there was a chance here, like after the Civil War ends, where the South is occupied by the Union Army, right? And basically, the way that they were going to enforce the end of slavery was with the army by having army bases in the South and having the military basically uphold the rights of black people. They also created the Freedmen's Bureau, which was like an administrative body that was supposed to help the now freed people and help them out if they were being treated unfairly or if there's violence against them and stuff like that. Because a big part of this is that you couldn't really trust like the local police forces to carry these laws out, right? Because they just fundamentally didn't agree with them a lot of the time, at least most people. So there was a chance there to do it this way, but Abraham Lincoln gets assassinated. You have Andrew Johnson become president during this time right as the war was ending. And Andrew Johnson was just, you can look at anyone in the 1860s, you could say that most people, I guess, were racist in the 1860s and that they thought there were like whatever differences biologically or something. You could probably most people were like racist like that, but Andrew Johnson was like someone who was racist to the point that yeah didn't think black people really should have rights or that it should be the job of the federal government to protect them as citizens and stuff like that. So this creates a big problem and really slows things down and really kind of makes slavery kind of continue but in a different form. So even though slavery was legal, you had states enact what they call black codes, which had all kinds of laws about like, some of them that black people could only have certain jobs, that they could only own certain amounts of land in certain places. They had vagrancy laws, they called them, where if they decided that you were destitute or homeless or a vagrant, which they could just make that up kind of, they could put you in jail. And a big way that I think slavery was kind of maintained in the South at this time was that there was a practice of using prisoners, people in jail, and basically renting them out to companies. So if you were a railroad company and you needed workers to build your railroad, you could go to a jail that's run by a state and for very cheap get these unpaid laborers to work on building your railroad. So it's like at that point, how is that any different, right? If it's yeah, these people doing backbreaking labor, getting beaten if they refuse to do it, dying from the labor sometimes. They would make them do incredibly dangerous stuff like work in mines and things like this. And yeah, they have statistics on like the average lifespan that a black person going to jail in the South at this time would have and how likely they were to die. It's just appalling stuff, right? So I think you would really have to look at this kind of compelled prison labor as very similar to slavery. And that went on, for a fair amount of time. And then you also had the growth of terrorism, right? You had the KKK, but also during elections, really throughout the 1870s, because it's really like the late 1860s is when they pull the army out And once you pull the army out, you're really just abandoning. They really just abandoned the black people of the South by pulling the Union Army out and leaving them to leaving for states like South Carolina and Mississippi to do whatever they wanted with them. And a real just one of the worst things about American history is the way that they gave up on the Reconstruction of the South. So yeah, after that happened in the 1870s, the 1880s, you have huge amounts of violence surrounding elections, where it was just like blatant, like there would just be militias showing up to voting booths and stuff, and just not letting any black person get in. There was a rebellion in a kind of rebellion in Louisiana in the 1870s, where I think what was it? I think it was the governor. They basically kicked him out because they took over the state house, and just like yeah, made this governor leave. So you had a lot of violence throughout the South and this kind of stuff. But the other thing is that you also had the black people who lived there organizing themselves. One way they did this were things called union leagues, which was a kind of like voluntary organization where they would create like an all-black militia sometimes to act as like their own sort of police force to try to keep their people safe. Um, and through union leagues, that they were able to organize and have connections to other groups throughout the country. So at every turn, when there was horrible oppression or violence towards black people in America, you also had black people organizing to oppose it, right? And I think that is the thing that makes me say you have to look at all of this as a civil rights movement. So yeah, and I think that kind of is where it stayed until we get to like the 50s with black codes having all these just racist and discriminatory laws, violence around elections, the KKK, all of these kinds of things. I think that's basically where we get to MLK in the 50s. So I also do want to look just very quickly at some of the things then after the 60s that I think should also probably be considered part of the civil rights movement. One thing just to note here is around the 40s, 50s, 60s, you have a lot of colonized countries gaining their independence. Like just to name a few, you have India becomes independent in 1947 from England. Algeria gets its independence from France, and these were usually through wars. India, not as much. Algeria, there was a full-out war where the Algerians fought France in 1945. Angola, another African country, gets its independence in 1961. Even something like Cuba in 1951, even though that wasn't strictly African. But I think part of like viewing this in an international lens is just this kind of movement. It's kind of like an anti-imperial movement, right? Where whether it was like in Africa or Latin America or Asia, even things like Vietnam or something, you kind of see like this, where you just had basically people of color all over the world against white people who were having colonizers, and specifically Europeans and America. So yeah, there's this kind of general movement in the middle of the 20th century towards like independence and self-determination that you can see through some of these revolutions and independence movements that I think again is useful context for thinking about what was happening with the civil rights movement, because I think it is has to be seen as connected to those things. So skipping ahead in history, just to give us some more recent stuff, because again, part of the thing about the civil rights movement is I don't think we can view it as like having an end, right? Because I think that would be to imply that like equality's been achieved, that these problems have been solved, that racism is not something we have to worry about that much anymore. So just some more recent stuff. You have like the Rodney King incident and the riots in 1992. Of course, Rodney King was, brutalized by the police, beat up terribly. There's a video of it. And you had riots in Los Angeles also in 1992. Um, Wait, I think I had something else. Okay, so here's a more like legal one. In 2013, there was a Supreme Court decision. So I mentioned the Voting Rights Act as one of the big like achievements of like Martin Luther King's era of the civil rights movement. And in 2013, there was a Supreme Court decision that kind of really people always say that it gutted the civil rights movement. It really took away a lot. I mean, the Voting Rights Act. It really took away a lot of the power of the Voting Rights Act, because part of the thing with the Voting Rights Act was that Most of the southern states, basically, if they were going to make changes to their election laws, they had to get approval from the federal government, and explain why they were making this change and basically show that they weren't doing it to discriminate. And the change they made in 2013 was that now these states are allowed to make whatever changes they want, and then someone has to sue them and say, oh, what you're doing is discriminatory. So basically, before, like, these things had to be reviewed before they actually happened. That's how it was from 65 until 2012. And then since 2013, it's been the case where they can make these changes and then someone else has to prove that it is discriminatory. So basically, you're putting the burden of proof on the voters and the citizens rather than on the state. So I think that is a modern thing that we'd have to look at that. If one of the biggest achievements was getting this law passed, having this law rolled back, I think needs to be looked at as part of the same movement again. So that was 2013. In 2014, you have the emergence of Black Lives Matter, um, specifically around like Ferguson, starting there, and yeah, kind of spreading all over the country, and just the kind of this kind of thing that I think we're more used to now of police murders, of videos coming out, protests resulting from it, lobbying for change, and no real laws end up getting passed, at least not ones that address the situation in the ways that activists are calling for. So I think you have to view Black Lives Matter as being connected to what MLK was doing, right? Like they're just doing the same thing, just in different time periods. And then, of course, the last thing I would have to say is, of course, this summer, the summer of 2020, I think undoubtedly you have to look at as an event within the scope of the civil rights movement. Um, because yeah, it's like so many of these earlier things, like whether it's in the 1800s, whether it's in the 1950s, it was kind of a lot of it was always about state violence against black people. Whether it was putting them in jail for forced labor, um, or it was the KKK, and local police forces not trying to stop the KKK. Um, whether it was violence around voting, or whether it's violence from police, you know. So I think that we have to view not only the kind of really old stuff I was talking about, but also the protest movement last summer and George Floyd. I think we'd have to look at that again as a continuation of the civil rights movement. So I know that was a lot. I just wanted to give us some historical stuff there. I would encourage you guys if you to maybe look up some more about this stuff. If there's any like specific event I was talking about that you think might end up being helpful for whatever poems you're looking at or whatever essay you end up writing. I would definitely read more about it, or even send me an email or ask me a question, and I can talk more about it. But yeah, I just wanted to give us some of the history that I think influences what we're going to be looking at here. And we are going to look at least one like current poem. I have at least one that's from like 2014. So I am going to really emphasize this idea of the long civil rights movement, viewing it as going all the way back to like the beginning of slavery and continuing to now. All right, I think that's it for this time.